on the Beaulieu River, right in the middle of southern England. I've been coming here in my boat since 1972, I reckon, but in 1986 I came up the river in my old pilot cutter, which was built in 1911, and I lived on her with my family. We'd just sailed home from America, we had no other home, and we needed somewhere to set up camp, really. And we came up the river here because I knew it was a beautiful place, and the harbour master took pity on us and he found us a berth. And we lived here on board for a year, and that has led to me keeping my boats here for 25 years. And it's been a wonderful relationship. I've been so happy here. But Beaulieu and Buckler's Hard, where we are now, is a lot more than just a pretty village in a pretty part of England. It's a place that is riven with history. You can't imagine really, when you look at these pretty cottages today here, that 200 years ago and more, the slipways behind me were seeing huge ships of war built to go and fight Napoleon and stand at the Battle of Trafalgar with Lord Nelson. In fact, one of the ships that was built here was the Agamemnon, the 64-gun ship of the line that was Nelson's favourite ship. I don't know a great deal about the history beyond that. Most of us who come up here have some idea of the way it was, but we don't know the detail. So today, I'm going to have a chat with my friend Mary Montagu-Scott, who's a member of the family really around here. She knows all about it.
Hello Tom, welcome to Buckler's Hard.
Well, thank you very much. We both made it in time. We've done well, haven't we?
We've done well.
I'm delighted to be doing this, Mary, because I've been coming up here, as you know, since 1972 in my boats. I've been drinking in the pub and seeing my friends, and I've seen this wonderful village and these remarkable slipways and all the rumours of great ships being built here, and I've read a few books about it, but to talk to you is a real, well, it's a bit special really, isn't it?
Well, thank you for coming. I can show you round. I want to show you the behind the scenes, get to see exactly how they built these ships, where they got the timber from, where the people lived, and all the famous stories behind the ships that served for the Royal Navy.
I'm curious as to how it all started really, Mary. I mean, we're on the Beaulieu estate, but we're in the middle of the New Forest here. Was there always a village here? Was it a fishing village?
No, it wasn't. So originally the New Forest was created in 1079 by William the Conqueror, and the Beaulieu estate was then carved out by King John in 1204 to create a Cistercian monastery built at the head of the river up at what is now Beaulieu village.
Yes.
So this river was the main artery for all the building materials that came up to build the abbey. And this corner of the river is a natural hard. And it's the point at where the tide, when it goes out, leaves a little bit of water. So probably from monastic times, it was always known as a hard, as a landing place for boats coming up. The village here wasn't started until 1722, when my ancestor, John, Duke of Montagu, created the village as an import town for sugar. He set out on an expedition to create his fortune in St. Lucia. He took 3 ships with him, and he wanted to try and build an industry around the import of sugar, and he applied for a free port status and created a new town here. It was going to be known as Montagu Town, but actually it was a total disaster. When they got to St. Lucia, the French had already got there. He lost all his money on the venture, but what had happened is back here the houses had started to be built and this village was created, and was then known not as Montagu Town but as Buckles Hard, after a Mr. Buckles, who was here as probably a boat builder from around the 1700s time.
Because if you were building serious warships here, and I believe that they were, I mean Agamemnon was built here, wasn't she?
Indeed, a 64 gun, but that wasn't the biggest. So even a 74 gun ship was built here.
They never. Did they build
yes,
a 74?
Did. 74, 3 74s were built here.
So that was the standard ship of the line, wasn't it, for the Royal Navy during the Napoleonic Wars?
It was, absolutely. Yeah. And to build those and launch them here and to get them out of this narrow river and across to Portsmouth was one very big achievement.
It's unbelievable, really, because, I mean, a 74 must have been, well, she would fill the river.
That's right. So 180 foot from end to end would have come right up the bank here and right sticking out onto the river there.
Yeah.
Really huge.
And what about the depth?
The depth of the ship. Yeah. In order to launch it, they had to deepen the river constantly to get these ships out on the highest water.
So they were dredging away?
They were dredging away. Even then, we've got drawings showing dredging lines from 1800 to show that they had to get the cost back from the Navy to dredge the river.
What about the timber? I mean, it seems we're surrounded by oak here. We've got a beautiful one down the bottom of the street here that's resplendent with acorns at the moment, a wonderful sight. Did all the wood for these great ships that were built here? Was it all sourced locally?
The actual New Forest is a crown piece of land, and it isn't a forest. It's called the New Forest. It's neither new nor a forest. It's actually a Norman word. The forest, Nova Foresta, implies a big piece of land, but not a wooded land.
Okay.
And the trees that were grown in the New Forest were for the royal dockyards. They were owned by the Crown, by the government. So all the timber that was grown went to Portsmouth, Chatham, Deptford, wherever for the Royal Shipbuilding. This is a privately owned yard on a private estate that happens to be within the New Forest. So the timber that was on the Beaulieu estate, the Beaulieu estate was about 10,000 acres. Yep. In those days there was probably 2,000 acres of woodlands here, would have been used specifically for shipbuilding, and that's one of the reasons why they chose this site, because there was this large estate around it that had timber.
Where did the ironwork come from? Did they have a forge on site?
So there was a forge on site here, and that would have been a big part of the industry here.
So he'd be banging out the nails and the bolts and things.
The nails and the bolts, and the keel bolts in particular.
Yes.
So the keel bolts on the Agamemnon were 16 foot long.
No!
Yes. So that had to go. Can you imagine fitting it? Because you'd have to have forged it and bent it in.
Yeah.
16 foot long.
Dear,
and the
dear.
wreck of the Agamemnon, which is in Uruguay in the River Plate, we've got some film showing those keel bolts still standing in the wreck.
Well, they'll be wrought iron, and the wrought iron just doesn't go away, does it?
And they're still sitting in the seabed where the wreck is.
Isn't that wonderful? They would need to be very, very snug in the timber so that when you whack down for the riveting, they didn't.
Can you imagine the noise of banging these huge bolts in? It would have been a very noisy yard here, actually.
It would, and all the caulking would have been a grand sound echoing back from these houses.
And all the saw pits and the men shouting and all the people around.
Yeah, I mean, what a rotten job being the bottom bloke in a saw pit, Mary. Can you imagine? What a card to draw in life.
Would have been bad, but I should imagine they took it in turns, don't you?
Oh, do you think they did?
Oh, I'm sure the underdog would have changed places.
What a generous soul you are. I always imagined the nipper was sent down.
The smaller person.
Yeah. I'm in the Maritime Museum and I'm looking at a model of HMS Euryalus, launched here in 1803. Just a while ago we were looking at a model of the whole village, and on the slipway was this vessel being built and just about to be launched, so it's a lovely little tie-up. The vessel had a very distinguished career, and at the Battle of Trafalgar, being a frigate, the eyes and ears of the fleet, she was out there signalling on from Nelson so that other people could see what he wanted, and she actually repeated the famous signal, "England expects that every man will do his duty," and there it is. It's flying now in her rigging. Later on she had a distinguished career, and she stayed in commission almost until 1850, or maybe a year or two after. Collingwood, who took over from Nelson after his death in the battle when Victory was shot up, his own ship was shot up too, and he transferred his flag to this vessel, and so it was on Euryalus that he actually penned the report that went back to London to tell the nation and the king of the death of our hero and the greatest naval victory of all time. So a wonderful vessel, but there's more than that, because when we look at her, we see, those of us with eyes of a seaman, we see a vessel of astonishing beauty. That sheer line running from the bow and sweeping up to the stern is something that William Fyfe, the great designer of yachts, would have been proud to have drawn. So what we have here is an engine of terrible destruction and astonishing beauty, launched here at Buckler's Hard. So we're down at the business end here now, Mary. This is, I imagine, where it all happened, because they couldn't build a great big ship in the middle of the street and hump it down here. It must have been built where it could have been launched. So are we actually looking at building ways here? What these are great.
These are the building ways. These are the slipways that were essentially put in 1770s.
Yeah.
At the time, the Navy was really increasing the demand for building ships, and the private yards were having to expand and build bigger ships. So there are 5 slipways here and a quay. And this is the biggest slipway here. This is the one that was used for the much bigger ships, the 64 or the 74 gun ships. And as you see, the angle of it goes out across the bend of the river where there's now this marina,
Yes.
so that they could, when they launched the ships, these really big ships, they could go down the full length of the river there in the bend. And the slipway here is at a declivity, ready, of 4%. That's what we need for launching ships.
That's the drag on the key, is it?
So that's the angle of which it
Yeah.
goes. And there were capstans embedded all the way up the high street here, which would have been for the brakes and locks for when they launched and could haul ships up or release them when they were launching. On the day of the launch, the Navy would send a huge crew of people to come and assist in the actual launch.
I see.
And they'd bring a cradle that would come over from the Royal Dockyard to put the ship in to help with the launching. And they'd grease the rails, they'd create rails with tallow.
Yep.
And then, of course, in the actual launch, the thing went into the river and then braked on the capstans to stop it just shooting off. It would have been a wonderful sight to see. And it would have pushed down the whole bed of this slipway here.
Yes.
Where the huge timbers that ran along the base of the working slip were pushed into the mud. And when we've done archaeology, we've found 8 timbers deep going down on this particular slipway, slipway number 1, where they've launched a ship, they've all been pushed down and then they've laid a new set on top.
For the next one?
For the next one. If you look over there, there's an example of one of the timbers and you can see the scale, so that's one of them.
That'll be
They're
a piece
big.
of greenheart, won't it?
It would have been actually, and I think a lot of them are elm.
Elm.
Because they're sitting in the mud.
Right, yeah.
And they are in the intertidal area. So they're actually underwater. And if you
Yeah.
dig down, not very far, you'll find the timbers are all still there, just hovering under that bit of grass.
So is this quay the one originally that was built to do the sugar trade that never happened?
I think that there was always a quay here because this is such a critical point in the river
It is,
for
isn't it?
people coming up and down.
Yeah.
And I reckon there was a quay here, but this quay essentially was built in the 1770s when they built the new slipways to expand it for an increased level of shipbuilding. And this quay has been rebuilt every 20, 30, 40 years.
Many years ago, when I had a boat that drew 8 feet, we dried her out here on the tide. We floated her in here on high water and we waited for the tide to go away, and then it went away. We scrubbed the bottom off with brooms and then we painted her when she dried out. But what we did here, there are planks running along the outside here. You can see them over there, as you well know. If the top plank was just on the waterline, you could float 8 feet draft in here.
Okay.
And you were fine. You didn't need an echo sounder. You knew that was all right. Mary, we've got a magnificent building here. It's just beautiful to look at, and I'm curious, and I'm sure a lot of people are, as to what it is.
Well, a lot of people mistake this for an original building from the 18th century, but in fact we only built it 5 years ago. We've built a replica 18th century shipwrights workshop here, and it was built from timber from the estate using the methodology that was used in the 18th century. So we used only hand tools from the conversion of the timber right through to the building. Basically, it's a covered workshop, and the idea is that we get boat building, shipbuilding, traditional wooden boat building here again at Buckler's Hard. So we've created a beautiful workshop. Now all we need is a shipwright to come and work here.
Yes.
So we're looking for someone to come and help run this and actually maybe build and do replica work or restoration work of old wooden boats.
Wouldn't that be magnificent? What about these houses?
Well, first thing to point out about this is that it's a very wide street. Now
Yes.
it was planned to be wide. I think that there was an aesthetic involved, but also that there was a lot of space for timber, for all the carts, you know, to be able to access the slipways at the bottom.
Yeah, yeah.
But also to point out that there's a rich and a poor side of the street.
Ah,
Now you'll notice with your eagle eye that these are 3-storey buildings
Yeah.
and those are 2-storey buildings.
do you know, I've been coming here for 40
Yeah.
years and I've never
Yeah.
noticed.
And you will also notice that on this side, they just look a bit grander. Look, that's got a cornice, that one there.
Yeah,
You
they
see
do,
there?
don't they?
And also, if you look at the window design, a bit more fancy on this side. They're much smaller. They're tiny, the cottages on
Yeah,
this side.
yeah.
And here they're proper houses. And this is the house where the master shipwright Henry Adams lived. And you can see that it's a much more substantial house. It's got a nice fancy door and it's got big sash windows. Really proper gentleman's sort of residence here. So on this side, probably you'll find the shipwrights, who were the higher paid workmen on the site, would have lived. And on this side, it was more the labourers and the sort of people who took in lots of lodgers.
My goodness, I could live in here, Mary.
You certainly could. So this is a shipwright's cottage.
Yes.
So the shipwright were very highly skilled people. They did a 7-year apprentice, and at the end of that 7 years, they could earn really good wages. You can see that they're literate. For instance, they have a book, they have a scullery, and they would have even been able to afford a maid. Wow. And this is a 3-story building. So above here there's a bedroom, and right at the top there's more rooms. You see there's food on the table. They have a really good standard of living here. It's actually really lovely. I can imagine living here.
It is, isn't it?
But I should imagine it was still quite a tough life, even for the people who were relatively wealthy. Tom, can I show you the chapel where I got married?
You got married here?
I got married in this tiny chapel. Let me show you.
Gosh.
And actually it was built originally as a cottage. Someone just lived here.
I thought so. When did it get converted?
Well, it wasn't until the 20th century it became a chapel, and it had been used for many different uses over its lifetime. Come and have a look. Come and you watch your head. So this chapel was obviously a cottage, and then it's been used as a shoesmith shop. There was a man who made shoes lived here. Then it became a classroom and a school for the village children. And then in the 20th century it became a chapel, and you see here the altar and the lovely panelling that was put in. And there's actually a door that goes directly through there into what now is the pub. So that's quite entertaining.
That'd be very useful for the vicar, wouldn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And the amazing thing is that a few years ago we had to refurbish because we had some subsidence here, and we took up the floor and we discovered underneath a smuggler's cellar under the altar, and that you can see just down there. When we actually got underneath here, it was full of old brandy bottles, old smoking pipes, and some lead pencils from the time when it was a schoolroom had slipped down into the pit underneath in the cellar.
Well.
Amazing. So under the altar, a smuggler's cellar.
Well,
How about that?
Isn't that wonderful?
So the church service still continued to this day. And as I said, I got married here and my children were christened here.
Really?
In this tiny chapel. It only seats
Mary,
20 people.
What did you do with all the people?
Well, actually, we had a few more hundred people outside, but we had a fantastically intimate wedding here.
How lovely. Well, Buckler's Heart is full of personal memories for me, having lived here for so long and having kept the boats here for so long. One of the most poignant is when I sold Herta, my pilot cutter, which I'd had for 15 years. It had been our home for 7 or 8 of them. My daughter had grown up on board. She'd been to school from the village here, and it was a very special thing for us, our relationship with that boat. And when we finally sold her, we decided that we'd throw a dinner party. And the dinner party guests were everybody who had been a significant factor in our ownership of the boat. So there were all sorts of old shipmates from the 7 seas and people who'd worked on the boat, and it was a great gathering of people. And the question was, where were we going to have it? And we decided that we would have it right here in the Duke's Bath cottage. In those days, this was up for rent for holidays and things. I think somebody lives here now, but in those days it was up for rent. And so that's what we did. We rented the cottage and we put the boat on the little dock down there, and we lit her up with all sorts of nice things. And then we got the folks in here, and people came from America. They were from all over the place. Norwegians arrived. And we had to put an invitation out with all the information on it. And we said, well, the question was, what was going to be the order of the day for dress? What was the dress code going to be? Well, obviously it had to be black tie. But there was a problem, because what you see here, I'm standing nicely on firm gravel. And most of the time that's how it is. But on a really big tide in the river, the tide comes right up over here, and it used to flood this cottage to knee depth. It was been known to happen. And it was a big tide the day we had the party. And high water was going to be about midnight, when everybody would be really getting stuck into the right stuff and having a high old time, singing sweet songs, reciting poetry, and having a night to remember. And so the dress code was black tie and Wellington boots.